Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on the ethics resource for the LDAT program. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which Laura and I are meeting, the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Before we begin, just a teeny bit of housekeeping. We have currently a Q&A box on your right hand side of your Skype screen or your web browser that allows you to type in questions at any time during the webinar. Please feel free to interact with us at any point. Just a short note that there is a 30-second delay, so keep that in mind, especially when we're approaching the end. If you have any questions that you want to send them at any time and we can answer them throughout or right at the end. Mm-hmm. I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. Yes. Okay. Oh, that didn't work. Here we go. So the resources for the LDAT program are all located on the Community Hub, as I'm sure most of you are aware by now. Under the Plan tab, so in the middle there, right at the top, you can see the little plan icon. So when you hover over that, a little drop-down menu comes down and you'll see one that's called Toolkits and Toolkits and Webinars, and then another one will be LDAT resources or something along those lines, key resources. So within that page, right at the bottom is the ethics resource. So just keep scrolling and you'll find it. Okay, so today we're going to go through the overview of the actual resource itself, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about, in a bit more detail about specific topics. So what are ethics, some critical values to think about. We're going to talk specifically about harm and consent, and also about vulnerable populations and ethics committees. Vulnerable populations are covered in a bit more detail in the resource, but ethics committees are that section's pretty brief, so we'll just talk about it a little bit here verbally, so that people have an opportunity to sort of hear about that.
Yeah, so we're really going to go to just skim over a lot of, because it is very information dense,
yes.
This resource, so we'll just sort of cover off on what you can learn more about in the resource itself, and then do a little bit of a dive into some of the topics we thought were key.
And I just noticed we have please unmute at any time, so that's not supposed to be there because you can't actually unmute yourself, unfortunately. You'll have to engage with us through the Q&A.
But please type a question at any time.
Yes, and if you could just type us a little hello and let us know that you're there, and we can engage that way. Okay, so the resource goes through ethics basics, so covering off what it is and some critical values. It also then goes through key considerations, things like harm, working with the community and language. It has considerations for individual stages of your activities, so you can really have a look at how you can apply this sort of work in your community when you're implementing specific toolkits or activities. And it also talks about next steps and some references for further reading. So that's kind of the broad brush overview of the resource. So we'll just go into ethics basics.
Yeah, so it starts with an overview of, what are ethics? Because it's something that we all have our own set of ethics and values, and they guide us in all of our day-to-day decisions, how we act in the world, how we treat other people, how we expect to be treated. But we don't often have a lot of opportunities to really clearly define and articulate what those ethics are for us. But this is a critical step for teams that are working together to understand and to describe their ethics, that they're going to share as a group, and really think about how they're going to apply them in practice. It's great to understand what your ethics are, but to really have that detail on exactly what that means in terms of working together and collaborating on an activity, and to be very transparent about that. And this protects not just the members of your team, but also everyone else that you're engaging, right? The community as a whole, your specific target audiences, having that kind of existing understanding and transparency about your ethical principles is a really important foundation to lay at the beginning of undertaking any work. We have that there too, that even the best intentions, so sometimes despite having really good intentions, we can accidentally act in unethical ways if we haven't really thoroughly thought through a program approach. The example we were talking about was things like going into work in culturally and linguistically diverse communities or in First Nations communities. but taking an attitude of we believe we already know what the problem is and we already know what the solution is, and we're just going to hand down this program. So you might go in with really good intentions to do good work and to help people in a sense, but it's not ethical practice, and that could be avoided by really thoroughly applying ethical principles at the start of your program and imagining what that looks like in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So we draw from the National Health and Medical Research Council's guidance on working with human subjects, and they outline a number of critical values. Did you want to run down them?
Sure. So basically the critical values are merit, which is basically like whether or not the activity that you're doing, in particular at the moment with LDAT, it might be with a specific toolkit, whether it has value within that community. So that's pretty straightforward. It talks about things like, is it worthwhile subjectively or objectively, and defining whether it's worthwhile to sort of collaborate with the community. I mean, definitely worthwhile collaborating, but whether it's worthwhile to the community specifically, so asking them. Beneficence is just looking at whether the overall benefits of the activity outweigh the potential harm or the cost. So looking at things like minimizing the risk of harm or discomfort to a particular group, that sort of thing. Integrity is really just about honesty. I don't really need to delve into that too much, I don't think. Justice is about being fair. So specifically it talks in the resource about vulnerable populations, which is a separate sort of section of the resource. But basically, like, if you're engaging people from a regional part of a state or territory, those people might need to travel to partake in an activity. Is that a level of involvement that's fair for that person, compared to like somebody who might be in the metro area already? So that's kind of an example. And respect is about, I guess, recognizing the intrinsic value of a human being. Also pretty straightforward. I don't think we need to
look at almost some of
delve into
these
that too much.
I know some of these almost seem like common sense, but research has a patchy history in terms of doing things like that. So it is important. So
things like respect really just comes down to understanding that people come from different backgrounds and different cultures and worldviews and values and all of that, and we all come together to work on these projects together. So respect is obviously a really important part of doing that sort of collaborative work. So
we do have a question about how LDATs can access ethics approval, with a mention about the cost of private companies and that sort of thing. So we will give essentially our guidance is to go through your relationship managers and to talk to them about the risks of your project, what kinds of approval that you might need, and then whether that's going through the NHMRC or going through one of the universities that has ethics committees. But the first step is to talk to your relationship manager about what those needs are, and then how you can access the appropriate committee to clear your project. But we'll mention that again.
We'll come back to it. Yeah. So I guess applying these values in practice requires serious and critical appraisal, as Laura's already mentioned. So we're going to move on and talk about two of them specifically in a bit more detail, because I think the others are a bit easier to understand.
Yeah, these ones maybe require a little bit more thinking through. And also, beneficence is a word that I would never normally use in a sentence, but it is a really important value. There we go. So it speaks to the expected benefits of your program outweighing any potential harms. That the risk of any harms to participants or to the community more broadly are really actively mitigated. And that's not just harm, it's also discomfort. That those risks are really clearly communicated in a way that people can understand, which brings us to informed consent a little bit later on, and things like using plain language, appreciating differences in literacy or in comfort with English as a language, and understanding that it's on the researcher or the person running the activity to make sure they're communicating in a way that their audience can understand.
And it's not just, I guess, about language. I mean, it's part of language, but it's also like concepts. So like literacy in terms of knowledge as well. And sometimes when we're talking about impact of alcohol and other drug use, it might be to do with health, and some people may not have the same level of understanding around potential harms. So
And there can be different
adjusting vocabulary as well as knowledge, right?
And concepts too, because there can be culturally different perspectives on what health means and what health entails. So it is very specific to every project and to every community, but is a really important value. And the other one we wanted to mention is justice, because like I said, research historically has been a bit iffy on this one. And that's really about looking at how fair is the distribution of benefits. Is there considerable burden or risk of harm to one population who aren't necessarily going to be the beneficiaries of that project? Who is being burdened in terms of participation? And really given that special consideration to vulnerable groups being given an unfair burden. Like recognizing that two people are not necessarily going to experience a burden in the same way. Like your people living rurally being asked to travel, or a spend of time or energy or some small out-of-pocket expense might not be a huge burden to one person, but might be a significant burden to another, depending on their specific circumstances.
And I guess the point there with regional and metro, I guess, is that the level of harm might be tipped the other way. So like the people who are burdened by the cost and time that's consumed by participating in like a focus group or something like that might also be experiencing more harms than the people in the metro area. So not only are they disadvantaged in that way, but they're also having to travel further to get their voices heard and their needs met.
Yeah, absolutely. So really,
it's a handy example.
and it's really worth taking those values and making sure that there is a really active conversation about what they're going to look like in practice for your activity, for your LDAT working together, and for the communities that you're working in.
Okay, so the resource goes through a bunch of key considerations that you can look at, and it's quite practical. Like there's a lot of information, as we've talked about, in the resource itself, but there's also how you can put some of these things into practice with some examples. So the key considerations that are covered are around harm and how to avoid harm in practice when putting into place activities as part of the LDAT program. So it talks about working within the community, so recognizing that the community is like really the expert. So going in, part of ethical practice is understanding from the community what they see as the thing that they need in this space. We also talk about language, so we've mentioned that already a little bit, and consent. So that's around providing people with enough information at a level that they can understand around what it is that you want to do, and gaining that consent in a voluntary way. Data collection is a really important factor with these projects or activities, I should say. Sometimes it can be really easy to collect information about people that's really personal and you don't actually need it, or that you don't end up utilising it in your evaluation, and it can be sensitive information. So it's really important to think about what data you're collecting and why, and does it suit the purpose that you need. So there's some really handy tips on how to do that in practice in the resource as well. And legal requirements, so this is the part that is quite brief, and it sort of touches on ethics committees, and like Laura's mentioned, it's quite specific to each community, and we won't go into it until the end, so I'll leave that, but that is covered.
Yep, so we do have a follow-up question about if universities in the NHMRC would be willing to review projects pro bono. We can't make any promises as to what the universities or the NHMRC may or may not be willing to do with specific projects. But again, those steps would be to work with a relationship manager about what the project is, why it needs to be reviewed, and then follow up on that and see if that's something that we can't make happen. Yeah,
I think that's the best way to go about it. And because it's going to be case by case, and ethics committees can be kind of time consuming depending on what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and not every project, not every LDAT activity is going to need to go through an ethics committee. We do talk a little bit about some of the content and the audiences that would start to raise that flag for LDATs and say, oh, okay, well, we might need to consider applying to an ethics committee, but not all activities will require specific ethics committee clearance.
Yeah.
Sorry
Okay.
to interrupt.
No, that's okay. I was towards the end of this slide anyway, so we'll move on. Did you want to talk about consent?
Yeah, look, consent is obviously a really critical element of ethical practice, and just making sure that we understand that informed consent focuses on every person's right to make a fully informed decision of their own free will. And that idea of being fully informed, of being able to understand that researchers or practitioners are communicating in an appropriate way that makes sense to their audience, and that they are indeed participating voluntarily. So specifically about that clear communication, that full understanding. And the point about being voluntary means that we need to be wary of unequal power relationships. So whether that's children who are obviously going to be dependent on their parents, or in an unequal power dynamic even with schools, or with people who are dependent on carers, to try to recognize situations when what counts as voluntary in what contexts, and also that opt-in is best practice, opt-in consent as opposed to opt-out consent, and also making sure you communicate that people know they can leave at any time and there won't be any penalties, that it's voluntary in an ongoing sense, and that people at any moment can say, I don't want to do this anymore, and pull out and not be penalized in any way. Back to ethics committees.
So we've talked about this already, but should I go over audience?
Yeah, and well, I suppose we wanted to say up front, as we were saying, that not every activity is going to need clearance from an ethics committee. But that if you're designing an activity that looks like it might, based on the next two slides, that cost might be an issue. I'm not sure what the NHMRC or universities would be willing to do, but also timing is something that we really do need to stress, that the time taken to get ethics clearance for certain activities will need to be factored into planning.
Definitely. Sometimes it can take a lot longer than you have to be able to actually fulfill or do your activities within the community that you're working in. So really taking into account and shaping your activity in a way that maybe doesn't need ethics clearance might be what you need to do. So it's really just a matter of case by case. So some of the sort of two key aspects, or sort of, I guess, red flags or triggers that might come up for thinking about an ethics committee clearance is when you're working with a particular audience that's maybe vulnerable or sensitive in some way. So thinking about cultural and linguistic minorities, so people who maybe have English as a second language and have specific issues around AOD. You may need specific clearance for working with them. Same as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. It depends on what you're doing. Refugee communities, pregnant women. Pregnant women is an interesting one amongst this group. And I think one of the key things that's kind of mentioned within the resource is that when it comes to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, basic, or FASD, as a lot of people just kind of roll that off. Basically, women often get stigmatized for their behaviors, or whether or not they've had them, and whether or not that's led to specific issues with their birth or their baby. And so it's around being really sensitive to that, because that stigmatization can cause significant harm to the woman having the baby. So that's why that particular group is in there. Even though it's like I feel like that one's quite specific, whereas the others are quite broad. The other two are basically people with intellectual disabilities and people living in other countries. So that's speaking to like people who might be Australian that you might want to work with, but if they're overseas, then there might be specific legal ramifications of doing a particular activity around those people. So that's kind of audience.
Yep.
The next part is content.
Yeah, so content that has potential to re-traumatize, incriminate, or otherwise harm. So I suppose it, again, very much activity dependent. Really, to us, a lot of it does come down to things like illegal drug use. We do have to be really sensitive when we're gathering data about that sort of thing, because it is still criminalized in Australia, generally speaking. And what was also raised to us was talking to people about their experiences versus their perceptions, that we do need to be very cautious to not re-traumatize people by asking them to describe certain things that they've been or certain things that they've gone through versus maybe their perceptions of things in their community. So it's just that was an interesting point for me as well. So obviously it's going to be really specific to every activity, but that's just a little bit of guidance in when your team will probably start to consider if you need to apply for ethics clearance from a specific committee. And we do have another question. But it's about evaluation. Yeah. So is the evaluation required by ADF a quality assurance exercise of the activity rather than an in-depth review of the impact on the community?
So when it comes to evaluation within the toolkits and when it comes to like particular activities within the LDAT program, in the CAP, I'm assuming this is a person who is from a LDAT that maybe is just preparing a CAP or in the process of.
Maybe.
Potentially. But basically the CAP has the requirement that you address or evaluate 2 impact measures and, is it 2 process, 1 impact? So at least 2 process and 1 impact. So having a look at the back end of the CAP and also the measuring your success part of each toolkit that you might be working in, that can really help you understand what you need to do in terms of evaluation. As far as I am aware, it's more about the in-depth review of the impact on the community rather than the quality assurance exercise. Does that answer the question specifically, I hope?
We'll have to give them a minute to hear it anyways.
Give them 30 seconds to respond, yeah.
Yeah, because it's two process, 1 impact measures.
Yes.
But there's no requirement that outcomes be measured.
Outcomes are really outside of the scope of this particular sort of project or activity space, because the outcome is about the overall outcome on the community. So for example, just to think of something off the top of my head, if you were working to reduce alcohol consumption among teenagers in a community, for example, and you might be working in the Strong Connected Communities toolkit and you're running events of some kind, you might be able to measure the impact on those teenagers by looking at, before and after kind of surveys or some kind of interaction. But when it comes to outcome, that's like down the track. That's 12 months, 2 years, 5 years down the track when you can compare data from the base. So that outcome measure is far more broad. That is actually, it's a good segue to mention that we have an evaluation resource specifically that's quite detailed. So that has information on what the different types of evaluation are at different points in your project. In your activity, and they also have examples of how to apply that particular evaluation approach for an activity that might typically be done by an LDAT by providing a table at the end of that document, and then it also shows you how to demonstrate that in your CAP. So there's really clear kind of worked examples that you can use to do your evaluation.
Yeah, I think there's four examples of what the evaluation expectations are in that evaluation resource. Yeah, 4 different definitely. Project examples.
Yes. So I hope that answered that question, but yeah, if not, you can always let us know after the fact. Okay.
There we go. Using the resources as a suite.
Yeah, so basically, as we mentioned right at the very start, under the Plan tab on the Community Hub, there is all the toolkits, all the webinars for previous webinars for all the resources and toolkits that we've already done. There's the Community Action Plan, and there's Building Successful LDATs, a practical guide. All these resources are really interlinked, and a lot of them refer to each other. So we recommend kind of having a look at them all when you're at the starting point, or even throughout, that you might be able to gauge how you can do your activity in your community. The ethics resource is obviously relevant to almost every single LDAT, as is like the evaluation resource, and the top 2 on this slide, whereas the toolkits are a little bit more tailored depending on what you're doing, and that'll depend on what you think your community needs and what your community said they need. Yes, I think I've banged on about that one for long enough.
Oh, about using everything as a suite. Well, we'll give people another couple of minutes if they have any other questions to submit. But yeah, absolutely have a look at the other resources. I mean, the resources were really intended to be applicable to all of the toolkits, no matter which one you're working on. So that's, the current ethics and evaluation, and then there'll be a stigma resource that'll be released soon that are intended to, be able to inform the whole suite of other toolkits that exist.
Yeah. Excellent.
I keep reaching for the mouse as if it's the laptop. Okay, we'll give it another minute just in case.
Yeah.
Anyone's just hearing the end of it and saying, "But wait!"
Pull out something interesting from this. We talked about harm. I think something that's worth mentioning, because the LDAT program is absolutely full of these, but using like acronyms and jargon when you're talking about language within the community, in this space we tend to have a lot of acronyms, so like AOD, the ADF, LDAT, the CAP. I can think of so many. It's important that when you're working in the community to, I guess, avoid acronyms and jargon, so that you keep the communication, I guess, at a level that the community can kind of relate to and not feel like they're, having to learn heaps to talk to us.
Fair enough. Okay, well, I think that they're good questions. If anyone thinks of anything after the fact, just funnel it up through your relationship manager, and we will endeavor to do our best to answer any questions that you might come up with later.
Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, guys.